Hello and welcome to the FPL tips video ahead of game week 36. My name's Rich and as always this video is brought to you by Fantasy Football Scout. If you enjoy these videos, please don't forget to like and subscribe. So I'm recording this, it's Thursday evening. Not much has happened yet. Zinchenko and Saliba, we've just found out, are out for the season. Obviously, you'll be watching this Friday morning, maybe later on Friday. So there's press conferences to come, and then we're probably going to get some team leaks once again, as we talked about last week, ahead of the game week deadline. So it's probably going to be one where we leave our actual transfers to the last minute. But what I'm going to try and do is ignore that and look into, a few talking points for this week. So the first one is one we didn't really expect to appear this week. We knew we wanted to have 3 Brighton. A lot of us has held, 3 Brighton for a long time, but Solly March is now injured. We're waiting for a confirmation that he's actually going to be out, but seeing as it's so close to the end of the season, we definitely need to look at Solly March replacements. We're going to look at the Newcastle Strikers. That seems to be a hot topic at the moment. It was a hot topic on the Scoutcast, so we're going to look at that briefly. We're going to look at lots of data in the Fantasy Football Scout members area. One of those is the Rate My Team tool, which you can access in the members area. So we're going to use that to look at the captaincy options for game week 36. And then we're going to go through some transfer thoughts. And what I'm going to do, it's very near the end of the season. So what I'm going to do is similar to last week. I'm going to look at my team because it's quite similar to a lot of other teams and the kind of transfers I'm thinking about doing ahead of the Saturday morning deadline. So let's get straight into it. So first of all, like I mentioned, Solly March, maybe later today on Friday, we'll get some updates. So keep your eyes on the video with, with Neil and Joe. But yeah, Solly March, if we assume he's going to be out, because we've got a double game week coming now with Newcastle and with Brighton. So first thing I've done for those watching, I've gone to the Scout members area and I've pulled together over the season midfielders, their XGI, so expected goal involvement. So a table I like to look at a lot. I could use a smaller sample, but I do like using the season long sample when possible. But I'm going to do a slightly smaller sample on the next slide. So what we've got here is no surprise. There's a couple of players well out of the price range for people with Solly March. Salah is top with 25 XGI. Closely followed by De Bruyne at just under 20. We've talked about this a lot. When Salah and De Bruyne, Salah's 5 clear of De Bruyne here, but nearly all of that, so nearly 20 of his 25 is XG. So much bigger goal threat for Salah, whereas De Bruyne is like the flip of that, isn't he? So his XG is only about 5.6. However, his expected assists are much, much higher than Salah's. So clearly Salah's the better, FPL asset, but De Bruyne has a double and Salah does not. So looking at players probably more in the price range. First of all, we got Odegaard. He's up there over the season, 17.17 XGI. We know he scored 15 goals this season, and that's from an XG of 9.84. Now, obviously, Arsenal, they have very, very good fixtures, but they don't have a double game week. So, we'll get onto this more later, but I've got Saka. And I'm actually going to be, as much as I love Arsenal's fixtures, I'm actually going to be looking at selling him because I feel there's midfielders we want more. We still want probably doublers from, Brighton. Salah, it goes without saying, look at his stats. Probably the king of FPL when it comes to midfielders at least. And then there's going to be players like Rashford and Bruno Fernandes that we're going to want as well. So for that reason, you could, if you're trying to be different, go for an Arsenal midfielder. I love Arsenal midfielders, but I'm probably going to be looking at selling mine. And it's a very regretful sell, and it's a one that could backfire. But it's worth noting Odegaard and Saka are high. So if you're willing to go without doublers, well worth considering. I haven't highlighted Saka purely because, Odegaard is 6.7 million, Saka's 8.1. We've mentioned it before though, Saka's got penalties. So if you've got that money, you're determined to go for an Arsenal midfielder. I think despite, him having slightly less points over the season, I much, much prefer Saka for these coming game weeks. Then we've got Rashford. So if you don't have Rashford, obviously Man United have good fixtures. Man United have a double. So Rashford 16.19, but he's only just ahead of McAllister, who is going to be a very popular replacement for those that don't have McAllister. We're talking 15.75 XGI. The XG on that is nearly 12, so 11.88 for McAllister. I think so. He's been my favourite of the 3 Brighton midfielders all along because he's on penalties. And it's also worth saying though, as a counterpoint, this is XGI, so it does include penalties, but I have included it you know, on this table, because he has penalties, so you can get lucky like that. And his stats, even though he's been playing deeper, that's been the narrative, and that's been the reality as well. He has been playing deeper, but he's getting those chances still. He's still getting in the box. Yes, it was a lucky deflection, but as we talked about on Scoutcast, he's in that position, you know, to get lucky. You know, he's in the 6-yard box, and he finds himself there quite a lot, surprising, you know, even though he's playing deep. He's, you know, very, very attacking for a player who can play deep, and he still can play, you know, in that inverted commas 10 role as well. You can see he's ahead of March for stats as well. Obviously, penalties have definitely helped that. And then I've also highlighted Grealish and Gundogan because, you know, a lot of people are saying that Grealish is the most nailed midfielder for City, and that is evidently has been true. But his stats, despite having 27 appearances, so only 3 less than McAllister, 11.34. And Gundogan, yes, he almost had a hat-trick if he could score that penalty. I don't think he's going to be taking penalties again, but 11.19. So my takeaway from this segment is if you don't have McAllister, go for McAllister. Now, obviously, Mitoma's not actually on this list. He played a lot less games, though, so just worth bearing that in mind. My favourite March replacement, it's not groundbreaking, but it is McAllister. I think just with the volume of fixtures, that's where I'll be going if I didn't have him. And I wanted to further support this by doing a slightly smaller sample size. So this, what we've got on screen now is over the last 6 games. So not 6 game weeks, 6 games. Yes, again, McAllister has had, you know, a couple of penalties to boost his numbers. Salah is absolutely clear. And I think when I come to transfers down the line, I'm not going to be selling Salah to go for other double game week players. I've already pre-planned for that. Maddison, he's up there, 4.9. Yes, he took a penalty. He missed a penalty. McAllister is right there in 3rd place, 4.50 XGI. And yes, you could take the penalties away. You know, penalties are what, 0.76 XG. So you could take a couple of those off if you like. But he's still got a 1.44 expected assists, which is better than Saka, for example. And his XG is still 3. So only Maddison and Salah, you know, top him here. He's ahead of Bruno Fernandes, for example. Again, penalties have helped. So there's that little bit more. It's a smaller sample size. I prefer going for the season long, but you can swing it both ways with McAllister. And then to further reiterate this point, you know, I've got on the screen the fixture ticker from Fantasy Football Scout, sorted by fixture difficulty. Brighton atop, obviously having a double, and then Aston Villa away. Now, both doubles have tricky fixtures. They got Arsenal away, Newcastle away in 36, Southampton at home, lovely, and then Man City at home in 37. So 37, at least it's 2 home games. Yes, the fixtures are very close together, and Brighton players, there could be some rotation there, but it's been so hard to predict that. The rotation's never as bad as, you know, like it is with Pep, for example. So for me, that move just seems easy. What we're going to move on to now is the Newcastle Strikers. So we did have a whole segment. Seb did a brilliant segment on Scoutcast on Monday. So if you've got time before the deadline, it's definitely worth, you know, going back, having a look at that. Everything's timestamped there. But what I've done here is I've gone into Fantasy Football Scout members area, and I've created a table of Newcastle Strikers and their minutes per XGI non-penalty. And then the lower the number for this, the better. So Callum Wilson, for every 85 minutes he plays, he's expected to get an attacking return. Isak, for every 198 that he plays, he's expected to get an attacking return. And Callum Wilson is, you know, with XG, so for a goal, 91.6. Every 90 minutes he plays, he's expected to actually score a goal, whereas Isak, 292.6. So he takes a lot longer to rack up an XG. Now, Seb obviously went through, it's a small sample, especially a small sample for Isak, but, you know, he's potentially a better finisher. You know, you can swing it that way, and he's going to get more minutes as well. Now, I was speaking to Gaza. He watches the Scoutcast. He actually DM'd me after the Scoutcast. He's a season ticket holder at Newcastle, and he is adamant, if they're both on the pitch, that Wilson will take penalties. So I guess the only question then is, who's going to get more minutes? Now, the consensus between Newcastle fans seems to be that Isak will get more minutes, but obviously when Wilson's on the pitch, and it's supported if you look at the heat maps on the screen across the season, that Wilson's going to play a lot more central, get a lot more touches, you know, in the 6-yard box, etc. Now, time played, so average minutes, So 18 appearances for Isak. He's averaging about 64.8 minutes. And then Wilson, he's had 27 appearances and averaging about 60. So, I mean, that alone backs up that Isak's going to get more minutes, or has got more minutes, you know, as the season started until now. Obviously, it played a lot less for Newcastle. But then you've got Wilson, who, if he's on the pitch, we are pretty confident he's on penalties and he's going to be playing more central. So I was quite down on both of these on the Scoutcast. I didn't mean to come across as negative, but I just don't think there's a standout. I think there's a lot to this. And that's why a lot of people are waiting for these leaks, because if we know Isak starts, that's the easier fixture. The first fixture against Leeds is the easy one, despite, unfortunately, that being the away game. So the only negative there. So I think it's very, very close. You've got to weigh up all of these things. Like, what do you care about? Do you care about minutes? Do you care about the player being central? Do you care about penalties? I'm leaning towards, because I'm quite big on minutes and penalties, and obviously Wilson has the penalties, Isak has the minutes. I'm leaning towards going for Isak. I haven't ruled out going for neither. But yeah, this is one of the trickiest decisions. I mean, it could be a huge swing. I went through the negatives on the Scoutcast of why I don't like going for both, and it's just because of the way the teams are structured. You're going to have Haaland, Wilson and Isak. Then you're going to have a really tough decision in 37. You're going to have a tough benching headache, because all the midfielders that we want in 37, and there's more than 5, there's probably 5, 6, potentially 7 midfielders we want. You're going to have to bench one and be playing this game next week as well, with a lot of money locked up front. So that's the reason I don't like going for both. I think we just got to try and make the right decision for one, and, you know, hope to get lucky, really. And I suppose all of that conversation about Isak or Wilson ties in very nicely with captaincy, because that's a big decision as well. Like, if you're not going to captain one of them, could you go without and then, you know, focus any transfers you have on 37? So I've used the Rate My Team tool just to put together, you know, who the model predicts at this stage in the week. So at Thursday night, obviously before leaks, which would affect minutes, which would affect projected points. Trippier is actually top, 8.76. Now, obviously that must largely be due to minutes, because you're going to predict he's going to get, you know, 88, 90 minutes in both. He has been prone to an early sub, but that tends to be in games where they're dominating, you know, when they're like 3-4, 5-0 up. Trippier had that run earlier in the season where he kept getting subbed, then the clean sheet would go, and people were surprised that he had this consistent streak of, you know, 7-8, 7-7-7. But I think there was a little bit of fortune in there. He also has very little actual goal threat. Cher has a lot more goal threat than Trippier. That's been a theme throughout the season. Obviously, Trippier, you know, he takes free kicks. He scored one against Man City early in the season. He scored a very famous one in the World Cup against Croatia in a semi-final. But Trippier's top, 8.76. Isak, probably because of minutes, is down at 8.04. Then you've got Pope, 7.68. Then there's, you know, best of the rest, Matoma, Botman, McAllister. The reason we haven't really talked about Brighton assets as captains is because their fixtures, I mean, they're pretty awful. They're Arsenal away and Newcastle away. Now, Zinchenko and Saliba are now ruled out for the season. Does that bump them up a little bit? Maybe. You know, I haven't completely eliminated McAllister. If I was going to captain a Brighton player, that would be my captain. Sorry to make the video all about McAllister, but I'm very torn at the moment. It's between Trippier, Isak, and between Wilson as well. And I think the team league is going to define where I go, but I completely agree with the scout here. I have no problem captaining Trippier. You know, say we don't get a leak, let's say you need to set your team now and you can't log in until the deadline. Trippier, despite the lack of clean sheets, I think he's a mighty fine asset, because, you know, despite those lack of clean sheets, Newcastle put up good defensive numbers still. So all you need is a clean sheet or two, a bit like the game week just gone, the one where Brighton played Man United. There were a lot of clean sheets there, weren't there? Like Brighton had two clean sheets. And it shows there is a ceiling for defenders in double game weeks. So why not the player who'd been the best defender in the game until Trent, you know, moved to his new role in midfield. Very briefly, before I run out of time, I just wanted to touch on a few transfer thoughts ahead of the game week. Now, on screen, I have my team. So for those listening, I'll read it out very quickly. I've got Steele in goal with a double. Now, he is, again, we touched on this in Scoutcast. There's some people worrying that he might be dropped. Now, we just can't predict that. Like we've already touched on, it's a tough game week anyway. You know, Arsenal away, Newcastle away. I've got Rayo on the bench. I know people like Seb have got Steele. Then he's got Kepa on the bench. who's got a great fixture. So if Steele gets dropped, I think it's unlikely, but if he does get dropped, I'm more than happy for Raya to just come in. He could, he could match Steele over this game week, and it's something I can then think about in 37. I've then got Botman and Trippier, who's currently my captain, perfectly fine. Full disclosure, I much prefer Shah over Botman, but this is the way the cards have dealt. I'm not going to be doing a transfer Botman to Share, but he has much better goal threat, despite scoring in the wrong net against Arsenal. And then Trent, he's away at Leicester. People have talked about the Boxing Day fixture where he got like 4 or 5 assists all those years ago. I don't think that's going to happen again, but I wanted to make sure I could put Trent in my team. I've got McAllister, Vice, then Matoma. So I've been quite lucky not having March. Rashford, Salah and Saka. And then Watkins and Haaland up front. My bench is a little weaker than some teams. I've got Solanke, Lewis and Zinchenko, who's now out for the season. So I think one thing to say, first of all, is I was quite happy bringing Lewis in because I had Zinchenko as like this expensive sub who was, going to be useful if I got any injuries. Now he's gone, it may change my transfer plans. So my original thought was just Watkins to Isak or Wilson, and then potentially look at captain in one of them. I don't particularly like selling Watkins, but the Newcastle fixtures, they've got Leicester in 37, so that seems like a decent fixture as well. And I could get really punished if I don't do it. So Watkins to a Newcastle striker seems very likely. Now, I do have the funds. So something I mentioned earlier is that the reason I brought Lewis in was because I do not want to sell Salah. I do not want to sell Trent. I want to keep them to the end of the season. And I knew it was likely I was going to be looking at Bruno Fernandes around this time. So I do have the money for a hit to do Saka to Bruno Fernandes. It's something, I love Saka. As I talked about earlier, I want to play him at home to Brighton. I think that's, it's not a great fixture, but it's a fixture he could, return in. He could do well. It's just whether I do Saka to Bruno Fernandes for a hit. Because Man United themselves have Wolves at home. Wolves, they famously capitulated a couple of weeks ago in an away fixture against Brighton. Also, it just would make transfers down the line easier because if I don't do the hit, next week I'm going to do Saka to Bruno Fernandes, and then I've got this tough decision. Do I do a hit to bring someone like Luke Shaw in, Ruben Dias, a City defender? So doing the hit now, I think Bruno is slightly better than Saka this week, and he's definitely better next week. And then I've got an easy, I don't have to worry about doing a hit next week because I've got a free transfer. One reason I'm thinking about waiting is I just think if you can carry transfers, I think I'd much prefer doing them, in that game week. A good example of why has been obviously the March injury this week. If people have 2 transfers, they're in a much better position. So with a double game week, the players are so valuable. I'd rather have as many transfers as possible and be able to make better decisions, hopefully. So I think I'm just going to do Watkins to the Newcastle striker and then captain a Newcastle striker or Trippier. So I think that's going to be quite a template move, but that's where I'm thinking at the moment. So I'd like to thank you for joining me today. I've gone over a little bit more than I thought I would. So I've been chatting a bit too much. So I'm going to go now, but please don't forget to like and subscribe. Drop any comments or dilemmas or if you want to put any thoughts on anything I've mentioned today, I'd be more than happy to, read over those and have a look. I'll be back next week. I can't believe there's only 2 game weeks left, but thanks a lot for joining me.